Hi guys, today's video is a little bit different to the normal videos that I've been doing lately, coming away from the lessons. Today, Revelation US hosted a webinar with DBTA, Database Trends and Applications, and Mike, Bob and Bryan spent an hour talking about the new features and benefits of OpenInsight. We recorded it and I'm going to hand straight over to those guys and OpenInsight 10, new features and benefits.
Welcome to today's webcast, brought to you by Revelation Software. I'm Stephen Fegg, Director at Database Trends and Applications in Unisphere Research. I will be your host for today's broadcast. Our presentation today is titled An Introduction to the Features and Benefits of OpenInsight 10. Before we begin, I want to explain how you can be a part of this broadcast. There will be a question and answer session. If you have a question during the presentation, just type it into the question box provided and click on the submit button. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but if your question has not been selected during the show, you will receive an email response. Plus, one lucky viewer today will win a $100 American Express gift card. The winner will be announced at the end of the event, so stay tuned to see if it's you. Now, to introduce our speakers for today, Mike Ruane, President and Chief Executive Officer of Revelation Software, Bob Catalano, Director of Sales and Marketing at Revelation Software, and Brian Shumsky, Senior Software Developer at Revelation Software. For more information on our speakers today, you can click on the arrow under their headshots on the console. Now I'm going to pass the event over to Bob Catalano.
Thank you, Stephen, and welcome everyone. As most of you are aware, over the last couple of years, we have undertaken a tremendous effort to rewrite our product OpenInsight. And we have released that product in April of this year. And we set out a bunch of goals in our design process, and we've met those goals. And those goals are, one of the first criteria where we wanted OpenInsight to be re-engineered for 64-bit. We wanted an intuitive user interface. We thought that was very important, and Mike's going to speak about that intuitive user interface coming up in the webinar. Actually, we wanted to have improved performance in the product so we can get more speed out of the product, and reinforce security and enhance web interface. And to do this undertaking, we've almost rewritten every piece of code in the product. So as an overview of what today's webinar is going to discuss, one of the first topics will be the new IDE. So in OpenInsight 10, we have redeveloped a brand new interface, which is very similar to the modern application development tools that you would see at a Visual Studio, for instance. But yet it's still familiar to the multi-valued developer. So we wanted to keep the best of both worlds for everyone. We were also very cognizant of the fact that we need user and data security to be much more strengthened in today's world. And we built a whole module around increasing that security, and Brian's going to talk about that later in this webinar. One of the things that was lacking in the previous versions of OpenInsight was an administration tool for the database administrator of the OpenInsight product. And what we have constructed is an element within the product called the Management Console. And this is a browser-based interface, and it allows that database administrator to maintain and manage the entire OpenInsight database application. We've also tightly integrated into our development process and into OpenInsight itself an interface into Git. Because OpenInsight is repository-based, it lent itself very nicely for our development methods to use the Git interface, which is an open source product, to manage our source control and distribute product. And we'll have a discussion about how we do that later in the webinar. We've also, as many of you know, within OpenInsight we have a web based product, and we call that OpenInsight for Web. And we have enhanced that product to use responsive forms, reports, and dashboards. So it's a rapid development tool, which has many facets to it, which will allow you to do web design within OpenInsight. Another goal of ours, OpenInsight being open, was to be able to connect to different kinds of databases, and some of which are many flavors of SQL. We've done a cloud database, and the first database through the cloud interface that we connect to is Couchbase, as well as the traditional multi-value databases, which include D3, QM, Universe, and Unidata. As many of you know, our company started with a DOS product, and that product was called Advanced Revelation. And those of you in the multi-value community started out in an R83 microdata model from years ago. So those stem back to the late 70s, and our Advanced Revelation product was from the early 90s. What we have been able to do is within our OpenInsight interface, we can create an emulator that emulates both the Advanced Revelation environment and a character to OpenInsight environment, which simulates like an R83 multi-value interface. And we've written that for 64-bit. So folks have been able to preserve their legacy applications and run them inside of OpenInsight. We also have a network product called the Universal Driver. We also engineered that to be 64-bit. We've encrypted the communication, and we've also added value VSS interface, which Brian will talk about later. And another nice feature is that we have entity-specific editors within the product, which we'll talk about later in the webinar. So I am going to pass this over to Mike. So go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Bob. So why did we create a brand new IDE for OpenInsight 10? If you remember every other version of OpenInsight since it was first released in 1992, we basically had a starting pad, and as you clicked the individual buttons or chose from the menu for the individual tools, it launched them, and they sort of lived in their own workspaces and weren't really all integrated together. Well, since then, when OpenInsight first came out, OpenInsight 2.0 back in 1992, IDEs have won the development wars. Nowadays, some of the more popular ones are Python, which is being one of the leading languages taught in schools, and its development platform is very similar to Microsoft Visual Studio, which is free to most students and what is being taught in the schools nowadays. And there's also IDEs like NetBeans or Eclipse that are used for Java. So you have a generation of brand new developers, and it's been a while now, and they are used to this sort of look and feel of their development tools. So these new developers are familiar with this sort of look. They know that they like it, they're comfortable with how they work, and they have certain expectations of how a design environment should work. So what we've done is that we took a look at some of the winning IDEs that are out there already, like Microsoft's Visual Studio. If you take a look at the screenshot, you'll see that you have a screen full of information there, all laid out for you. There are panels containing different information such as code snippets, some properties, some methods. We have a menu up across the top. We have the different tabs that are showing us the information like the forms or the events. There's a toolbox over there on the side. So you sort of get the idea that it's all there, that you can see everything at a glance, that there's no information hidden behind somewhere else. You just have to sort of open up the correct tool to get to it. So we came up with the OpenInsight 10 IDE, and I'm showing a shot of that right now. So if you take a look at that and you compare it to the previous slide, you'll see that they are very similar in look and feel. You have a single menu going across the top. In this particular example, we have the form designer highlighted. On the left-hand side, you can see that we have a list of the common controls and an expandable list, so you can add additional toolbars and things like that. On the right-hand side, we have another panel which is showing all the properties for whatever control is being worked on right then, whether it's a report or a form or a program. They all have a lot of common elements. And then down at the bottom, we have this output panel. So we've mirrored a lot of what goes on in the existing IDEs that are out there, but we also have TCL, because some of us, we always want to live by the command line. And we've taken the same philosophy to the O4W IDE. So this is our browser-based development platform. And if you take a look at this particular view, you'll see that we have a site that should be familiar to you after the 3 or 4 slides that we've seen already. So we have a list of controls over on the left-hand panel. We have our panels in the center where we're actually doing our actual design work. Over on the right-hand side, we have our properties. And these panels are resizable. You can move them around. I know the resolution for this particular slide is small, so the properties, all the tabs there look sort of bunched on top of each other. When you're running it yourself, hopefully it looks a whole lot better. So if we go back to our IDE, which IDE provides the best interface? Why would you want to choose one IDE over another? And which one is better depends upon who's asking it. If you're a new developer coming out of school and you're used to using something like NetBeans or Visual Studio or Python, you're going to want to use the IDE that we have built into OpenInsight 10 with the panels that we just saw before. If you're an experienced multi-value developer and you sort of appreciate and like using just a single command line interface, we have the ability to launch AREV64 or our CTO screen that lets you go into there. Or if you're a web-based developer, you can use the O4W. And probably one strong advantage we have here is that all of these are part of the same product. It's not like you need to install OpenInsight 10, OpenInsight 10 for the web, OpenInsight 10 for multi-value developers. OpenInsight has all these pieces built into it at the same time. So if you think about what we have inside the scope of the IDE, we have our design pane, our designer space, and that's our main workspace. That's, if you're standing in front of your workbench, that's where most of the stuff is going to happen, right in front of you. We have our property panels, so that as you're working on these individual components, you don't need to do a shift double-click or alt double-click or control space minus double-click to find out what's going on behind the scenes. It's actually right there out in the open. Prior versions of OpenInsight, a lot of the designers, you had to know how to see these properties. And in OpenInsight 10, we make sure they're right there out in the open. We have our output panels available so that you can always see what's going on. In prior versions of OpenInsight, a lot of output would go to maybe a status line or maybe to the system monitor. But if you had a tool laying on top of that, it might hide that output from you. You didn't know if something was going on. So the IDE with the output panels there sort of helps out with that. The tool panels let us know which tools we're working on right now and which tools are available to us. So you have an idea of what's open. It's a lot easier to just click between tabs than it is to alt-tab all around a screen trying to find where you're just working before. We, of course, have our start page, which shows you, aside from just the most recently used items that you are working on, it also has live feeds from our website. So you have information about what's going on in the Works discussion group, also what sort of announcements we put out there. We have TCL. We love our command line. And we have a TCL assistant up there. So while you're looking at a program and you need a quick snapshot of the data, you can just run a very simple list statement and have it all appear right there in front of you. And then finally, we have our favorites, recently used toolbox sort of list of items. So you know what you've been playing with and you can actually get to them rather quickly. So now with the list of items put back there, the screen sort of falls into place a little bit easier now. You have an idea of what our design theology was behind it to put this screen together to make it look like this. And so in our form designer here, again, we have all the properties on the one side, all the tools on the other, output panels and things like that. So what we have next now is some of our enhanced user data security. We called it reinforced. It was pretty strong before, making it much stronger now. And Brian, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, as Mike just mentioned and Bob said at the top of the presentation, reinforced security is one of the goals of OpenInsight 10. And towards that end, we've implemented an entirely new authentication module. You can't go a day without reading in the papers about hackers coming in and stealing secure data from a database. So we wanted to try and make sure that OpenInsight now uses industry standard best practices to secure your data. Towards that end, we've implemented this concept of a security policy.
the policy controls, access, and user permissions, you can, as a database administrator, choose how you want your passwords to be formed, what level of complexity should be required of the users, how often passwords need to be changed. And these password requirements and password changes and attempts to access the system can now be logged as well, so that they can be reviewed to make sure there have been no incursions in the system. Once you've set the policy, for each individual user who's going to access the system, you now need to create user permissions and passwords. In OpenInsight 10, we've consolidated the user database for the OpenInsight desktop as well as the O4W web development toolkit, so that all users are now in a single database inside the system. From the user administration screen, you can choose whether or not a user should have access only to desktop applications, only to web applications, or to both, and what level of permission they should have in each case. You can also lock a user, and the system will also automatically lock users according to the policy if there have been repeated invalid attempts to get into a particular application or by a user using incorrect passwords. Now, this is all built into OpenInsight itself, but in some larger organizations, you may wish to use Windows security rather than OpenInsight's own security. We've implemented single sign-on functionality so that you can, if you're in what's called an LDAP environment, have OpenInsight refer to the Windows LDAP service to get the proper username and password for allowing somebody into the database. You can configure the permissions that go along with the particular Windows groups so that you don't even need to specify a user in OpenInsight anymore. Just say that they're a member of the appropriate group, and then they have access. In this fashion, administration and checking of permissions is all managed now by the Windows administrator as opposed to the OpenInsight administrator. For the web access, you also can use what's called OpenID Connect. This is a Google-backed initiative for an single sign-on security in web products as well. This is also available in OpenInsight 10. Speaking of the web toolkit, Bob's now going to talk about the management console that we include in OpenInsight 10.
Thank you, Brian. So as I mentioned earlier, one of our goals was to create a console for a database administrator of the OpenInsight environment, and to provide at that administrator's fingertips a myriad of information for management. So when you launch the management console, the first thing that happens is that the information being presented is about statistics going on with the engine server that's running in the background. This is a browser-based interface, and that was key to our design, because having this browser-based interface, we are now remotely able to administer different concepts of database management administration tools remotely. No longer are you tied to the console. You can do it right from a browser base remotely and manage the system. So one of the things that's important is to access just vital system information at a click of a button. So we can provide engine details, network driver details, and that's really helpful for a system administrator when they're having issues and they need to contact us. They can have all of this information at their fingertips and provide it to us. Not only do we know what the serial numbers are, we know exactly what release they're on, what ports the network drivers are communicating on, are they using secure communications or not. So this makes diagnosing problems a lot easier for us, as well as rapidly getting solutions for users. lacking in the previous versions of OpenInsight were statistics on our filing system. So we provide, as I said a moment ago, engine service statistics, but we also provide database statistics. So we have, in a graphical presentation, we can look and see what are our worst size files, which ones have the most data overflow, which are the biggest files in byte size, which files contain the most number of records. And from this, we can then produce a report, and from that report, we are now able to manipulate and maintain file sizing on the fly. And this can be done on an application-by-application basis. It doesn't have to be global. Everything that can be done from the desktop IDE can also be managed through the management console itself. So as Brian talked about creating and editing users earlier, the system administrator through the management console can also perform that function right through the management console. For those of you who have used the universal driver in the past, we used to have our record locking done through a manager that was tied to the server where the universal driver was installed. We freed that up because now we can access this information through the browser, through the management console, and that database administrator can release locks remotely. So you no longer have to go to the server in order to perform that function. Another new feature is something we've called the command channel. So let's say you're a database administrator and you need to perform maintenance on the server at a certain time and date. You can now globally send out over the network to each of the users a message saying that the server is going to have maintenance performed in 10 minutes. And after that 10-minute period of time, if you see that some of the users still haven't been logged off, we can actually log off a session using the command channel. Other things you can do, if there was a hung select statement going on in the background and you needed to terminate that select statement, we have an ability to do that. So this is a very powerful tool that can be configured for system administration use. So as we reported earlier in those graphs, we now have something for what we call linear hash management. So we call our multi-value database linear hash. That's the name we use for it. And if we have file overflow and poorly sized modulos, we can use the linear hash management tool, and that tool will allow us to resize those files so that they hash correctly, and you'll get a better performance system. Another component of our filing system is the DBT. It's the database. When we have a utility that can manage the DBTs. Sometimes this DBT, which is a file that sits outside of OpenInsight, can become corrupted, and this utility will allow you, the database administrator, to repair it. We also provide the ability through the console to manage the connections, whether it's to the multi-value based filing system, the cloud-based filing system, or the SQL-based filing system. So that can be controlled. Applications can be created on the fly through the console, and then within those applications, tables and their indexes can also be maintained. Within OpenInsight, we have in our system environment file many configuration records. And over the years, as we grew with complexity in our systems, we've created these numerous configuration records, and they've become difficult to manage. So we thought it would be nice to have a management tool in one place where you can pick the specific configuration record that you're looking to maintain, and you can set the parameters within each record through the browser-based interface. And the same can be done with the traditional OpenInsight environment settings on an application-by-application basis. One of the nicest features I think that we've come up with from a management point of view is the way we redo our authorization codes and licensing. In the past, our licensing was DLL was in memory, every user had to be logged off the system in order for end users or database administrators to reauthorize, relicense the product or up a user count. That is no longer the case. When we distribute you an authorization code, you can apply it through the console or from the traditional IDE. And when you authorize the product, it can be done with users online. So that's going to be a huge savings for all. We also have the ability to manage our engine server. There, again, it is so much that this engine server does. It's almost like the heart of OpenInsight can run on these background engine processes. And the configuration of them is now all controlled, again, through the console in this browser interface. So we have the engine server itself that can be managed. We also embed inside of OpenInsight 10 a web server. It's an internal web server, so that if you don't want to use IIS and you just want to use internally our browser-based products, such as the console, out of the box, you can configure the internal web server through this tool. As you saw, we produce statistics, and those statistics are then served to this console through the statistics server. The command channel that I just talked about is done through the command server. We can manage background processes and also get debug settings. We also provide the ability to do all the O4W configuration through this tool set, as well as managing your registry settings that O4W utilizes. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Mike, and Mike's going to talk about how we integrate with Git.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so our Git integration. For those of you that aren't familiar with Git, it's a source code management or version control system. It's widely used around the world. There's a central location called the GitHub that Microsoft just bought for, I think, multiple billions of dollars. And it's free and it's open source. It works very well with Windows-based development platforms. It's easy to install on your PC or onto a separate server. There's something called Git extensions, which lets it sort of work with a GUI interface instead of just using command line, which many people are used to. There's also something called Bonobo, which is a Git server for Windows. The idea here with our Git integration is that we're always writing on code, and we're always making changes. And at some point, we've all gotten down to the point where we go so far and you're like, oh no, let me go back. And you can hit the Control-Z key so many times to undo it, but sometimes it's just not enough. There's also ways that you can have teams of developers, because most developers in the Revelation world are small teams, one-man team, maybe 2, 3, 5, 10-man teams. But teams of developers will be working on the same code at the same time. Somehow all the changes have to be resolved and brought together in the same sort of place. And that's what Git does for us. Most people may have the opinion that Git is mostly for text-based operations. So I'm writing a program, and I've changed line 17 to have this many statements and this many characters, and I changed it to this many characters, and we should change it and save it to the repository because Git has a repository as well. Well, what we've done with OpenInsight is that we have exceptionally tight integration with our repository, so that every time one of the OpenInsight tools makes a change to an OpenInsight entity, everything from just an application row, so like an entry in one of our configuration tables, all the way down to just changing the width of one control on a form in the Forms Designer. These changes are tracked, and they are dropped into the Git repository. And then once they've all been tied into the Git repository, you have the ability just to store them there. You can commit them. Once they've been committed, you can actually go into OpenInsight tools, and based upon your configuration settings, you can have OpenInsight actually drive the Git extensions. And then you have the ability within OpenInsight to pull in all the changes that have been made and are stored in the Git repository since the last time you pulled, all the ones that were changed within a certain date. And it gives you the ability to really track the changes that you've made to your software. And more importantly, assist in getting your data out there, your application out there to people, and to figuring out what's gone wrong when something in fact has gone wrong. one of the things that's inside the Git environment that people like is a blame tab, that you can actually find out who made this change when, and you can assign the blame to the developer at that point. But we're very happy with our Git integration. It was a little difficult for us at first because we weren't used to working that way. But over the development lifecycle of OpenInsight 10, it saved our bacon a few times. We actually use the Git integration tremendously, and it works as well as it does because we had to rely on it so much. So now we have some new features in O4W. Brian, this is you.
Thank you, Mike. So we were just talking about Git. Git is an open source toolkit. We're big believers in leveraging open source solutions. For our web development toolkit, O4W, we use something called jQuery. It's one of the largest open source JavaScript development frameworks. All of O4W depends on jQuery and jQuery's later developments called jQuery Mobile. O4W itself is a web development environment, a web development toolkit that lets you create forms, reports, menus, dashboards. You've already seen examples of the O4W output when you've seen us talking about the console. All of the OI console is developed in O4W. We're strong believers that web interfaces are an important way to present data and allow interaction with your users going forward. So we've tried to bind that into OpenInsight fairly tightly. O4W consists of a number of wizard tools. For example, you can define the menus that you want to have somebody able to access using the O4W menu designer. For the menus, you choose other O4W reports or forms or dashboards that you want to have available, and these can be customized based on how the user has logged in, what permissions the user has. They can either not see the menu at all, or they can only see specific items on the menu. In addition, although you define the menu generically once, how you embed it in a form or a report will determine how it's actually rendered on the screen. It might be drawn as a tree menu, or as a sliding menu, or a drop-down menu. These are all different choices that you have when you actually incorporate the menu into the output. The layout, the definition of the menu stays the same, but the rendering is going to vary depending on how you've used it. So what can you put in an O4W menu? Well, for example, you can put an O4W wizard form. And an O4W wizard form walks a developer or non-developer. This can be made available to power users if you feel that that's appropriate, because it doesn't rely on any programming. The O4W wizard form walks somebody through the generation of an interactive web form. You specify the name of the table and the fields that you want to have either displayed or modified. You have a variety of different types of controls that are available, and you can select which records you want the users to see or change, all through individual specifications by following the wizard. The O4W wizard generated form is a standard 2-column output. However, using O4W's WYSIWYG form designer, you have much more flexibility in generating web forms. The O4W WYSIWYG form designer is a drag and drop interface. So unlike a wizard interface where you specify everything and then the wizard determines where everything is placed, with the WYSIWYG form designer, although there's an initial wizard step you can run to lay out the form initially for you, you then have full freedom to move things around. We have we have almost all the available web elements you could think of in our palette of controls that you can drop on. And these include desktop-specific controls as well as mobile-specific controls. The output that you generate with the WYSIWYG form designer can be targeted either to the desktop or the mobile device. So it's generate once and then display on any available web-capable device as appropriate. We give you all kinds of properties that you can use, everything that you can set either in the mobile environment or on the desktop environment, even allowing you to insert your own custom classes. And both the web designer, the form wizard, and the WYSIWYG form designer support the calling of basic plus routines, as what we call them commuter modules, for you to add additional logic, or call business logic before updates, before reads, anywhere in any number of events. Sometimes, however, you don't want the user to enter information, you only want them to be able to generate reports or see output data. The O4W report wizard lets a developer, or again a power user, if you'd like, generate an output report. Like the forms wizard, the report wizard walks somebody through the process by asking them for the table and then all the fields that they'd like to see. They can specify fields that should be broken on, totaled, subtotaled, averaged, and one of the powerful functions in the report wizard is that you can choose to hide a detailed report and show only summary, but allow the user to drill down and see the details that compose that report if they wish. The output of the wizard can also be used to generate PDFs or comma-separated values for download if those options are chosen during the wizard definition process. You specify selection criteria and sorting criteria like you would in what we call a TCL or English report. And in fact, the O4W report wizard can even take an English report and turn it into an initial web report. You can then go in and change it, customize it, save it, and make it available. Put it on a menu, and then users have direct access to it. The dashboard in O4W is a way of bringing all of these different pieces together. If you think of the reports and forms as tools that developers or power users may use to see output, sometimes you want to have a higher level view for management. The dashboard lets you make a management style report. In an O4W dashboard, you can embed multiple reports or PDFs or banded reports, which you can also generate in O4W. You can also incorporate graphs, and in the console, the graphs that you saw are dashboard reports. The graphs can either be using something called jQplot, which is a jQuery graphing library, or Google Graphs. And Google Graphs allows you to use maps and heat reports and all kinds of pretty three-dimensional and two-dimensional output so that you can show people the status of your company, the status of your application, and they can get a nice high-level view. Behind all of these tools is a series of Basic Plus API calls. These can be used directly if you want to have complete control over the output you want to generate for the browser. So the O4W APIs are available for you to use in commuter modules that are called by reports and forms, or you can start from scratch and completely write your O4W web output using the APIs in Basic Plus. And as I mentioned initially, because O4W relies on jQuery and jQuery mobile, you can create your own mobile output for the variety of devices out there that everybody is using now to browse the web. So you're not just limited to desktop browsers anymore. You can create mobile-specific applications which rely on jQuery mobile to handle the actual layout of the user interface. Bob, you wanted to talk about AREV64 now.
Thank you, Brian. one of our goals was is the preservation of legacy applications. And we've succeeded quite nicely in accomplishing that by creating an advanced revelation interface as well as a character to OpenInsight interface. And as you look at the images on the screen, we could see the advanced revelation interface that sits inside of OpenInsight 10 is an exact emulation of the original MS-DOS emulation, or MS-DOS application of advanced revelation. It runs your advanced revelation applications run as is within this emulator. Conversely, on the traditional multi-value side, we've also created the character to OpenInsight interface, and we can take an account save, for instance, from a D3 application, and account restore it directly into OpenInsight, and our conversion utilities run through, converse all the dictionaries, and we recompile the programs, and you can have an existing legacy R83 type traditional PIC application running in a console within OpenInsight. All of these controls are 64-bit controls, which allows, for those of you who are on advanced revelation, no longer are dependent upon old hardware or operating systems. So you can run on a Server 2016, or your desktop can be Windows 10 Creators Edition, and your advanced revelation application will run as is. So Brian, I'm going to turn this back over to you with the universal driver.
Thanks, Bob. So the universal driver is kind of the heart of the OpenInsight database. It manages all of the access to the linear hash files, and everything communicates with it. O for W, AREV64, CTO, and of course OpenInsight. The universal driver makes sure that all of these different components and all of the different users of OpenInsight can access the data properly without contention. It manages the locks, it manages sizing of the files automatically, and we have upgraded the universal driver for OpenInsight 10 to the universal driver 5.1. It's a 64-bit version. We've recompiled it and upgraded it with the latest communication technology at the same time as we turned it into a 64-bit product. One of the features we added, again harking back to the idea that we want to reinforce security on the desktop as well, is we've now added secure communication options. What that means is you can choose to run the communications link between your OpenInsight and the universal driver either in legacy mode, which is what we have right now, running on your older versions of OpenInsight, or secure mode, where the communications between the client and the server are encrypted, or even in authenticated secure mode, which means that a list of available and valid clients are first registered with the universal driver, and only those clients can communicate over the encrypted channel to the universal driver. This makes sure it doesn't allow random people to talk to the universal driver to try and access the database. We've also given you the ability to retry connections if there's a communications issue between the client and the server. The client will attempt to reconnect multiple times to reestablish your link. Universal Driver 5.1 also has support for VSS. VSS stands for Volume Shadow Copy Service, and this is a feature that's implemented in the operating system. The Windows operating system allows backup software to take a snapshot of VSS-aware files so that the time that those files are unavailable because they're being backed up, is much reduced. By making the universal driver VSS friendly or VSS compliant, if you use the appropriate backup server, you don't need to bring down your system to back up the files to make sure that they are quiescent for backing up. Instead, the backup software will issue a command to the universal driver. The universal driver will temporarily pause update access to the files while a snapshot is made, and then user processing will continue. In yet another move to make the universal driver more friendly in large production environments, we now allow you to toggle whether or not you want the universal driver to automatically resize your tables when it feels it's necessary. While this is a great feature, in a 24/7 shop, it might be inappropriate to slow down access to the data files for a resize. By now allowing you to manually turn this functionality on and off, you can control when you want to take the performance hit
Sounds like we may have lost Bryan there for a second.
direct to disk or right through the buffers are issued from the universal driver into Windows.
Hey, Bryan, we're just having a little trouble hearing you. Mike or Bob, would you like to address this part, or would you like to move into questions?
Actually, we're up to Mike, so Mike can talk about data connectors.
Sure, let's talk about data connectors, because what good is a database product unless you can connect to some database somewhere? So, as Bob's mentioned already, and Bryan has a couple times, OpenInsight ships with its own database engine and its own data storage called Linear Hash. It's been around since the late 80s, gone through modifications over the years as we keep expanding and data gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's built into OpenInsight, and as a default, all the OpenInsight tools treat the linear hash data. They're built for it, so it's very happy with that. But we also recognize that there are other data sources out there. And if you can recall from when we first took over Revelation 18 years ago, and we began the road shows where we said we're going to put the open back into OpenInsight, we really started to increase some of our connections and connectivity to other databases. So we have, if you look at the list right there on the screen, you can see that we have a number of connections there. We have the ability to go to a cloud-based database, and right now we go to Couchbase for that, and we have some options in the future for other databases. For the multi-value data sources, we pretty much cover most of the ones that are out there. Rocket owns Universe Unit Data D3. We connect to them. We do not connect to MVBase at this time. We also connect to Ladybridge and ZoomaSys's QM database. As far as SQL-based databases, we connect to pretty much every flavor of SQL that there is, but in our defined list, we have AS400, DB2, MS SQL, MySQL, Oracle, Postgres, and even SQLite. And should someone invent another flavor of SQL, it'll be relatively easy for us, theoretically, to make it connected to that version. In many cases, connecting to other databases isn't so much a technology issue, but it's more of a business case issue. Is there enough business for our customers that it is worth it for us to make all these changes and create a new connector? So our data connectors are in, they're very robust, they're all in use now, and as people require more of them and the business case is good, we'll create more. And the one last thing I think that I have to talk about is our entity-specific editors. If you recall, the early versions of OpenInsight and versions of Advanced Revelation, we had editors to look at your data, to look at your programs, to look at your script, your store procedures, maybe even to edit the structures of application entities that you had created, such as reports or forms. In OpenInsight 10, we have specific editors for different things that you might look at with an editor. On this slide here, we have two examples. We have two screenshots. The one on the left is a screenshot of our stored procedure editor, where we have line numbers turned on, we have keyword coloring turned on, we probably have auto completion on the braces turned on. And when you're working in a stored procedure or script editor, we have tooltips available for you, so that as you begin to type in the name of a system function, it comes up with the name of that function, gives you a list and a bubble help of the parameters for that function, and as you begin to enter in the parameters, it automatically highlights the next parameter in the list so you know where you are in that piece. We have all sorts of options and abilities in there, such as the ability to double-click on a function and open up that source code, to double-click on a Go sub and have the system bring you down to there. It's a very nice editor, and we've used it tremendously in writing OpenInsight because, as it has been for years, most of OpenInsight is actually written in OpenInsight. So we've made very good use of our editor. Another change that we have is that for our records editor, and that's the example there on the right-hand side, you can see that we're looking at raw data here, but we have these highlighted characters, and you can see that they either say V or S in them. We have line numbers, and so we're looking at a data record here. And if you look up on the tab, it says that we're looking at the H_customer record, or H_customer table, and the G, I can't read the number, record. And I can tell you that line 81, which is highlighted there, if you look at the drop downs there, we actually tie the data records back into dictionaries. So the editor knows that line 81 is the field called LCDT, and it has a conversion on it, and we've O-converted for you and showed the data next to it. So these aren't big groundbreaking things, but there are lots of small little details we're paying attention to because as developers, we want everything in the product that can make our lives and you as our developers more productive and have the end result for our users even better than what they have right now. So I think that's all that I have. Stephen, are you here?
I am here, Mike. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened with my phone. So why don't we move on to some other questions from our viewers today. What are the hardware and software requirements to run OpenInsight 10?
This is Mike. I can take that. You're probably, if you get a machine that runs Windows 10 right now and it's a 64-bit machine, that's probably going to be very sufficient for OpenInsight's purposes. You can have older 64-bit machines, but with the hacks that Microsoft and the various hardware developers have put in there because of the meltdown and Spectre viruses built in the CPUs, it slows down processing enough on CPU-intensive applications. OpenInsight is fairly CPU-intensive. So I would say a modern 64-bit machine running Windows 10, and as always, with as much memory as you can cram into it. It supports high DPI, so if you have a nice big monitor with really good resolution, we can make good use of it.
Understood. Thanks, Mike. Moving on to our next question, what is the cost of OpenInsight and how is it licensed?
I'll take that, Stephen. Bob. OpenInsight is licensed and priced for the developer and then for the deployment to the end user. For the developer, we call it a work subscription, and the price is $1,595, which is optionally renewable each year thereafter for $995. Each Works developer gets a 3-user copy of OpenInsight, and they can free to do development, and from that work subscription, they are now able to then deploy the application. When a Works member is deploying to an end user, the price of the product is $324 per license. That license is subject to an annual license renewal fee of $65 each year thereafter. If you are using our web product, then the minimum requirement
in a deployed application is a 10-user license.
Understood. Thanks, Bob. Okay, moving on to our next question. What other cloud-based databases or plans, Mike?
Right now, we support Couchbase. We've been working with it for a couple of years. It was one of the early leaders. It's free, which is big in the multi-value world. Low cost or free is always friendly. So we're connected to that right now. We're also looking at MongoDB and MariaDB right now as cloud-based ones. What's also interesting is that a number of the regular SQL databases now are effectively cloud databases as well. I know that MySQL is one, for example. So just to sum up, we have a Couchbase connector already. I would probably guess that Mongo or MariaDB will be the next ones after that, and then we'll sort of play it by ear. Some of these cloud-based databases didn't exist 2 years ago when we started this, and we'll see what happens in the next couple of years.
Understood. Our next question from our viewers today. If a form was developed in OpenInsight 9, will it load correctly in OpenInsight 10, or will some changes need to be done?
This is Mike. I can take this one too. When you convert an application from OpenInsight 9 to OpenInsight 10, there's a whole converter utility that's detailed in what you need to do to bring the parts over. But basically, you create the same application name in OpenInsight 10. You run this utility, which asks you where the original application exists, and then it pulls all the information over into OpenInsight 10 for you. And any entities in OpenInsight 9 that need to be modified for OpenInsight 10 happens automatically during the conversion process. As you can imagine, with all the advances that have happened in GUI capabilities since the earlier versions of OpenInsight, we have a lot more things that we can do with a form, for example. There are different fonts, there are different effects, there are ideas of glyphs and different kinds of buttons, different kinds of menus. Our choices have really, really expanded, so that when you have to create a form in OpenInsight 10, the number of attributes or the properties of things inside of OpenInsight 10 are greater, much greater than they were in OpenInsight 9. So when this conversion process goes through, we handle all of that for you, so that when it all goes right, once you've converted your application from OpenInsight 9 to OpenInsight 10, it should run as is. Should be some slight changes that you may notice, but nothing so big that it's not going to run, and you should be very happy with the end result.
Understood. Thanks, Mike. Our next question is, OpenInsight 10 only available for 64-bit servers and 64-bit clients?
The answer is yes, it's only available for 64-bit clients and servers.
Understood. Okay, our next question. Have there been any further developments to server processing instead of distributed processing, for example, index updates?
Index updates can be done through the engine server, which is more server-based. So if you're using our engine server, our embedded engine server, to handle the indexing, and that's configured through the configuration record, which I went over in the console, you can manage your indexing on a server basis.
Understood. Our next question, are there latency issues when using data encryption?
Yes. If you're using data encryption, there will be, you'll take a performance hit. There's no question about it because of the encryption and decryption that takes place.
That's true not just in OpenInsight 10 or 9, but it's true in all software products and just daily life. Just imagine when you're walking into your car or into your house that you just open the door and walk through, or you walk to your door, you stop, you get out your keys, you find the right key, you put in the key, you turn the key, you walk through the door. Security costs more time.
Understood. Thank you, Bob and Mike, for weighing in. We have time for one more question today. Will promoted events in OpenInsight 9 also work in OpenInsight 10?
This is Mike. Yes, they will.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that is all the time we have for questions today. We apologize that we weren't able to get to all your questions, but as I stated earlier, all questions will be answered via email. I'd like to thank our speakers today, Mike Ruane, President and Chief Executive Officer at Revelation Software, Bob Catalano, Director of Sales and Marketing at Revelation Software, and Brian Shumsky, Senior Software Developer at Revelation Software. If you would like to review this presentation or send it to a colleague, please use the same URL that you used for today's live event. It will be archived, and you'll receive an email tomorrow once the archive is posted. Now, as we stated earlier, just for participating in today's event, someone would win a $100 American Express gift card, and the winner today is Douglas Owen. Douglas, we will be in touch via email so you can claim your prize. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Okay, well, I'd like to say thank you to the guys at Revelation, Mike, Bob and Brian, and also DBTA for hosting that webinar. I thought I knew most things about OpenInsight 10, but I'm glad I gave up this evening because I learnt a few new things. Before we go, I just want to touch on the OpenInsight evaluation. It's available from both the websites, both revsoft.co.uk and also revelation.com. We're looking at the RevSoft webpage at the moment. If you click on the Get Started link at the top here, that will take you through to the Evaluation Software page. Click on Get Started and that will take you straight across to revelation.com and straight onto the evaluation page, where you can read all the information, the system requirements, you can get your authorization key, download the file, install it, and you can play with the evaluation software for 30 days, all of the tools. And if you've got any issues, questions, need any help during that period, then contact your local Revelation office and we'll be more than happy to help you. So this is Martin. Really good video looking at the new features and benefits of OpenInsight 10. And tomorrow I'll be back into more training videos. So until then, bye-bye.